Good afternoon, everyone. If we could get this afternoon's meeting underway. I think we're all in a slight state of shock having an executive board on a Monday afternoon. It doesn't quite seem to fit with the normal way of things. So before I start, could I welcome Hannah Kershey to the meeting? I think you're sitting at the back. Yeah, I'm very pleased to have you here on, gather you're on work placement with us. So I hope you find the whole proceedings informative and enlightening. Is that the right expression? We'll ask you afterwards. Okay, so if we could get underway, please. Any appeals?
Appeals, Chair. There's been none received today.
Exempt information?
Yes, Chair. Appendices 1 and 4 to Item 9, which is the development of a district heating network, and also Appendix 1 to Item 12, which is the Leeds 2023 European Capital of Culture bid interim report, are proposed to be designated as exempt from publication.
Okay. Late items?
Thanks, Chair. Yes. A report entitled Grenfell Tower Update has been circulated to board members and is proposed to be considered at today's meeting as a late item of business.
I propose to take that item at the beginning of the communities part of the agenda, so it would go between item 20 and 21. That's okay. Item 4, any declarations of disposable pecuniary interests? No. Okay, can we confirm the minutes from the 21st of June as an accurate record of that meeting? Yep, take that as a yes. Okay, let's move on to the main agenda. Councillor Heron for Children and Families, please.
Thank you, Chair. So item 6 is on page 17 and takes up quite a large part of the first bundle on the agenda today. So this is the annual statements for reports for the fostering and adoption services at the Council. It sets out the position for the Council at this point in time in terms of our adoption and fostering services, and highlights some of the challenges that we face, particularly around recruiting foster carers for young people between the ages of 10 and 18, which helps to explain some of the budget pressures that we are suffering, and members will be well aware of the impact of the Staying Put initiative on those numbers as well. So the success that we've had in terms of those initiatives like Staying Put that are actually doing the right things for young people and supporting them in the right way, which then mean that we don't have those foster carers becoming available to take on new young people in that same age range. And it also just draw members' attention to the launch of the Regional Adoption Agency, which has gone remarkably smoothly, is now up and running, and we have across the 5 West Yorkshire authorities one adoption agency with staff who now fall under our umbrella but work across the whole of the West Yorkshire area, and have slotted into position and seems to be working remarkably well. I think I'll leave it there for now and see if there's any questions.
Thank you. Any comments? Councillor Carter.
Just on the regional strategy, and now that that's being rolled out, presumably we're going to have reports back on how it's too early really to see what improvements, if that's the right word, are being made, but at some stage we will be able to see that and be able to measure it as against our previous performance on our own. So presumably we'll get that information back at the appropriate time.
Do you want back, Councillor Heron?
Yes, certainly we'd be very happy to bring reports back to Executive Board, maybe an annual report or something of that nature. The Under the arrangements for the Regional Adoption Agency, there is a joint committee of members across West Yorkshire. So the relevant Cabinet Executive members across West Yorkshire sit on a joint committee, and I chair that as we are the host authority. So we've had a couple of meetings already, and we will be monitoring progress in terms of the agency, but clearly if there are any issues we'll make sure you're aware of them, and be happy to bring an annual report at any rate, whether it's going smoothly or otherwise. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, you decided to come in. Yeah, sorry, Councillor Galton.
Thanks, Chair. I note that this item is the item just before the one about transport, and our looked after children and transport are, of course, the biggest pressures on the Children's Services budget. But the one thing that stands out for me, seeing and having read those two papers, is that the second paper on transport actually has a realisation of what needs to be done in terms of changing the way that we do things so that we still have a responsive service, but it also responds to those pressures on those budgets. But with the Looked After Children paper, I appreciate the majority of it is around your statements of purpose, but there isn't actually any mention at all about budgetary pressures in there, and I do think that is remiss.
Steve, do you want to come in on that?
Sorry, just resisting the temptation to vote. It's important to place these within the context that these are the Fostering Adoption Service and the Adoption Service's annual statement of purpose. So they wouldn't reflect the overall budget position of Children's Services. However, what I hope would be known to members is that over the past 5 years we've been working very hard in terms of recruiting additional carers to Leeds, and we have significantly reduced our dependence on independent fostering agency placements, which are down by over 100 in that period. The fact that we've been able to do that means that we're now able to do targeted recruitment for carers within specific age groups where we have identified that there is demand. So there is an overall, like to reassure members, there is an overall budget strategy for Children's Services, although it's not reflected in these papers.
Sorry, yes.
One other question that maybe I help.
Yep, Councillor Carter.
What percentage of foster placements are, for want of a better word, outsourced as a proportion of the total? And do you have what you regard as being the achievable target in terms of that? If so, what is it? Because that would could significantly impact on the budget.
Steve, I think that's one for you, and obviously picking up on the complexity of some of the cases involved.
Thank you. The number of children placed in independent fostering agency, as I said, has gone down significantly. I'd expect to see the majority of children in the region of 80% placed with in-house foster carers. We now have 700 in-house foster carers, and I think we have in the region of 200 to 230 children placed in independent fostering agency placements. It's important to see that in two contexts. The first is people may recall that in the dark old days we were inadequate, and that meant that sometimes children were placed in independent fostering agency placements because we did not have any placements available within Leeds. Those children are there, they're settled, they're doing well, and therefore it's not fair or appropriate to move those children for financial reasons, and I absolutely know that nobody here is expecting us to do that. There will be a small number of children where we have they have additional needs that we would want to place them in placements where there was more specialist provision or outside of the area for specific reasons. And so we will continue to require a small number of placements in order to do that.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
I was just going to flag, I thought it was really good to see in the report the Appendix 1 of the first report, pages 36 to 50, where there are the examples of the sort of activities and projects that our foster families have been on, and the amount of those that are as a result of the partners in the city making making contributions effectively. And it's linked to that last question, I think, because one of the ways that we can be really attractive to foster families rather than an independent contract, I think, is by giving that extra set of things that you get for being part of the Leeds family. And it's just, some of the stories are just brilliant in there about friendship groups that have formed and activities that kids would never have gone on, and it's just a really human element to the story that it's great that we've got that in an annual report, which sometimes they can be quite technical, and that tells a bit of the story about what we're trying to do differently in Leeds, which we'll come to on the Child Friendly City agenda.
And just to conclude by saying an enormous thank you to all of those people in the city who do step up, and the ones who do actually perform extra duties on top of their fostering requirements in terms of being fostering ambassadors and helping us with different meetings around the city, helping to promote what we do, and the most important thing as well is recruiting new foster carers, which we need to be promoting all the time, and I think we do that, and we do a very good job. So with that, can we agree the recommendations of item 6 and move on to item 7?
Thank you, Chair. So item 7 relates to transport support for children after the age of 16 who have special educational needs and disabilities. And again, members of the Executive Board are well aware that this is another area of pressure on the Council budget. So if you have a look at the appendix, which I think starts on page 169 and sets out the consultation that's taken place around this work, which has been I think it's been under review for a few years now, and there's an infographic which sets out the sort of numbers, which is easy to look at a glance. So of the 277 young people who are currently in receipt of post-16 transport assistance in the city, the settings that they're travelling to and the distance that many of them are travelling, and some of them, because of the economies of scale on those journeys, are having very lengthy journeys whilst those means of transport pick up a number of young people on their route. So we have consulted widely with families on this issue and listened to what they've told us in terms of their feedback, and the proposals that were initially made to change the transport arrangements have been altered significantly as a result of the feedback from parents, and the proposals now will make a reduced saving on that initially set out, and but in the process of that they will make it easier for those children and families to make the adjustments to the new arrangements, assuming that Executive Board supports them today. And the way in which the proposals are now set out is very much in line with our strategic ambitions and our restorative approach of trying to work with families rather than doing to or for families, and how we also support those young people who are in post-16 education to move towards a more independent adulthood and to be best prepared to achieve the greatest level of independence that they can. So the proposals are in the paper. It will save 0.83 million pounds, so less than originally intended for the council budget, but I think it's done in a way which actually will make that transition much better and easier for the people who will be affected. So just one other thing, I remember, we have engaged with Children's Services scrutiny throughout the process, and this process goes back, I think, not only beyond my time as Executive Board member, but before Councillor Eden's time as Executive Board member for this particular portfolio, and scrutiny have been heavily involved throughout that period of time. And there is a report attached from scrutiny with their findings on this latest consultation as well, and their recommendations to Executive Board, which are put to members as well.
Thank you. Councillor Carter.
Yes, Chair. Obviously a sensitive area, and I'll pick my words carefully. Obviously, quite right to look at how the budget can be better managed. However, I have some concerns about this, because it seems to me that you haven't scoped out the effect on the individual families of the changes. And that's, if I'm right, surprising, because this same group of people are well known to the local authority, because you're in the process of a consultation exercise relating to the post-16 SEN offer in its totality, and an undertaking was given in connection with that each family's circumstances will be individually looked at before decisions were taken. You will be aware of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that changes in the national formula, we were asked that our silks should comply with the national formula in terms of funding, as opposed to the offer they've currently been giving for the past 4 years. And what concerns me is that some of these families would find the offer that's in here insufficient and would cause them particular difficulties. And I would have preferred this paper to have come to us when that scoping out work with the effect on the individual families was known. And as far as I can see, this paper doesn't do that.
Sue, if that's something that you'd like to pick up.
Thank you, Chair. With this process, we've been very clear that we will be, once the policy is approved and the changes to the policy that are recommended in this paper, that we will be talking to all individual families about their own personal circumstances. However, I would say that we have informed every family that will be affected by these proposals. On the day that the papers were published, every family was sent an individual letter to explain what the proposals would mean for their individual young person. We also then gave the opportunity for families to contact a dedicated helpline and an email address if they had any concerns or questions. We've had we had a couple of calls to that line, but very little response from families. So to reassure members that we have individually contacted all families about these proposals. In terms of individual circumstances of particular families and what their circumstances are in relation to these proposals. Once the policy is approved, we will then, as we committed to all the way through this process, assess each child and family individually and look at their own circumstances in the round. As part of this decision making for families, the decision about what their post-16 learning provision will be is part of that consideration. For those for young people who are making those decisions in this next academic year, they will be aware of the changes to the transport policy as approved, and therefore they will make that decision based on the information that they have about their circumstances in relation to transport. So we have taken those two things into consideration, and the timing of this proposal means that any changes will not come into place until September 18 for any young person who is entering post-16 education from September 18. All those young people that are currently in post-16 provision, as you'll see from the paper, the transport arrangements will remain as they currently are. So those arrangements will remain until they end that phase of learning. So we have got a year to prepare for this and to ensure that we assess all families individually and take all their circumstances into account.
Thank you. Bolton.
Well, I was very encouraged by this paper because it had a narrative within it which talked about how the council had originally wanted to address the costs in a non-statutory area and how they'd actually re-evaluated what that consultation should be based on the feedback they got. So it might have taken a little bit longer than that timescale which was originally anticipated, but it actually means that the outcome is far better in terms of not just the value for money for both the taxpayer, but also in terms of the frontline family involvement as well. And as a ward member, I know of several families that are affected by this, but not one of them has been to me to complain. So I have great confidence in the way that this is being implemented.
Thank you. And if anything does come up, we'll obviously refer straight away to you for further consideration. Okay. With that, can we agree the recommendations and move on to the next paper? Thank you. Sorry, Sue, would you like to come up to the table? Apologies, I hadn't connected your presence with the paper.
Thank you. Thanks, John. We made a statement of
it's on page
from our
229 in the
229, I believe. And I just wanted to ensure that the Executive Board would actually take those into consideration, if you don't mind, because they are slightly different to those from the actual scrutiny, the actual report that has come to you. So we're really asking that you first of all sort of take into consideration, the Director takes into consideration looking at the increased possible cost of transport, looking at the changes that may happen due to inflation in the allowances that you're going to pay people. And the other one is that we need to ensure that our young people and families, that we look at the impact and the experience that they have been having from this particular policy, and that we look at that and ensure that the Director understands their particular experiences. Also that council members or councillors are made aware of this change in policy so that they can help any residents who have children with special educational needs and disabilities. And then that those parents and families and young people who have been affected, we can identify any clarity around the allowances and this change of policy for the parents, and we offer continuing support, which I think has been highlighted by by the report, and that we provide evidence. I'm really sorry. And we establish the impact of the policy and revisions on young people and their families, and establish the impact of that on the council budget and also on the budget for young people and children's families. I'm really sorry about that. But can you please take those 5 recommendations into account? I wasn't actually expecting to speak because I did ask earlier, but I do want to make sure that these are taken into account because they are really important. Our working party has worked really hard to ensure that we've looked at this policy in depth and challenged children's services to ensure that the families and the young people who are our most important concern, that they actually do have a policy that befits them, and that none of our young children with extra complex needs are left by the wayside, because their transport will continue in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Bentley, and apologies for not referencing earlier, but I think, as Councillor Harris said, everyone is very grateful indeed for the work that Scrutiny has done on this, and it's been a really excellent piece of partnership working. Everyone is very supportive of your involvement, and I think Councillor Harron just wants to reassure you. I'm seeing lots of nodding heads around the table, but if you could pass back our sincere thanks to those members who have put a great deal of time into this piece of work, we'd be very grateful. But I'll just, Councillor Harron.
Thank you, Chair. We'll do that.
I'll just let Councillor Harron come back in.
Sorry, just to add my thanks and to say I did draw members' attention to the scrutiny recommendations in my opening remarks, and we will be sending a briefing note to all elected members which will cover your recommendation 4, and recommendation 1 I think was to draw the attention of the Executive Board, so that's at least 2 of those covered. So we will obviously take away the other elements of the recommendations of scrutiny, which has been very constructive. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
No problem at all. Thank you. Okay, can we agree the recommendations and then move on to your last item, Councillor Mulherin?
So thank you, Chair, and I'm sure all members and surely everybody else in the room will by now be aware that it's the 5th birthday of Child Friendly Leeds. So it's 5 years since our initiative to become the best city for children and young people to grow up in was launched, and the paper sets out some of the progress we've made on that journey. Clearly we're still on the journey, but we have come a long way already on it, and we have now over 700 child-friendly Leeds ambassadors, and most of those are partners from outside this organisation, so lots of the businesses in Leeds, and it sets out the way in which the whole city has embraced that ambition and the vision that we have for the city and for our young people, and the way in which, as Tom referred to in the adoption and fostering report earlier, our partners have worked with us to support some of our most vulnerable young people in the city, as well as that wider ambition of ensuring that every child in the city has a happy, healthy, safe environment to grow up in. So just recommend the report to members, and hope you'll join with us in celebrating 5 years. Clearly the start of our journey, but our 5th birthday is, I think, something to be celebrated, and we have actually come an awful long way towards our ambition.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Galton.
Undoubtedly, Chair, there has been much which has been achieved through child-friendly Leeds and its effect over 5 years of influence on the way our city functions. However, I am an opposition member and I am meant to challenge, so I hope you'll allow me to make a few comments on this. Some of the figures that are in here are a little bit spun. In terms of the looked after children, it implies that the council has made a saving of £20 million over that 5-year period. That is creative accounting, especially in the context of the 3 past years having been about overspends in the Children's Services budget, particularly in that area. I appreciate the council has done a fantastic job on NEETs, and it's done a very good job in terms of getting corporate backing in terms of the child-friendly Leeds ambassadors. However, I think sometimes we need to be less celebratory and challenge ourselves a little bit more. I had a surgery this weekend, and I had 2 women come to see me who were either side of a particular household where it was a very chaotic household involving drug use, alcoholism. There were 3 children living in that house. The households on either side, on one side is a looked after child of ours where we have responsibility for them, and on the other side was another lady who was looking after 3 children. Both households afraid to go out into their own gardens, both households afraid of who would be knocking them up in the early hours of the morning. A potential of at least 7 children that could be affected seriously through non-coordination of agencies that are meant to be putting their interests first in a child-friendly city. So there is a lot that's been achieved, but we still have a huge amount in terms of how our own council departments respond, whether that be housing or social care, and also our partner agencies in the police to actually get real-time solutions to some of our children in the city. And I don't think that challenge is emphasised anywhere in this paper, and I just thought I'd bring that up.
Steve, do you want to come back? I'm sure that particular case from Councillor Galton's surgery will be coming your way. It's very difficult to comment on something that we don't have the background story to, but the general principles, if you could.
I think one of the most positive things about Leeds is its ambition for its children and young people. So that whilst this is clearly a celebration of 5 years of child-friendly Leeds and what we have undoubtedly achieved during that period, I'd just like to reassure members that we're in no way complacent. We're very aware that there is more to do, and we're very focused on doing that. I think the budget savings in relation to looked after children need to be set within a much wider context, which has seen £43 million of government grants actually come out of children's services in that 5-year period. Our spend on placements has actually reduced from 46 million to 34 million, which is an annual saving of £12 million. So we have done a lot, but absolutely in no way complacent that there's more to do.
I don't think there's anyone round this table that would even begin to suggest that the work we've done has solved all of the problems that families and young people are facing in our city. I think the question is what we do when we are made aware of particular problems, and I hope you don't have any concerns in that area, Councillor Galton. I mean, this is work that, I'm afraid will never come to an end. We will have to keep going, keep assessing the impact, and we raise on a regular basis the impact of policies that are massively increasing the pressures on families, the levels of poverty that are rising, and particularly the levels of poverty for children who live in households that do have income coming in. There's certainly no complacency here, but I do have to say that we are in a much better place than we were several years ago, and I think the adoption of the child-friendly ambition by the whole of the city has actually stood us in good stead, in that so many more people now regard caring for children as being part of their business, which they certainly didn't do before. But this is much wider, this whole agenda, and it is about working with different agencies, different professionals, the private sector, to make them change the way that they actually work. And I think putting children and young people at the heart of our regeneration strategy, for example, is a very good way of making sure that we effect change that we need to happen to help us move forward. I think Councillor Mulheron, do you just want to come back?
Thank you. Just very briefly, Chair, as I set out in the opening remarks, this is a work in progress, but actually, if you think about where we've come from to where we are now, actually, we have made huge progress in that short amount of time. And, for every example that we could give in a city of 185,000 children, of people who are struggling, who we are working very hard to support, there are countless examples of people who have benefited from this programme as well. Through work we've done with partners, for instance, around when we commissioned the new drug and alcohol treatment services, that we actually ensured that those services for adults had a think family approach and that they considered the children in those households as well. So if you're looking at a household where people are struggling because of drug and alcohol issues, our treatment services in the city now take a think family approach and look at whether there are children in that household who need to be supported as well. And the work that we do to celebrate the achievements of our looked after children in the city and our care leavers, and just on Friday nights we were at Elland Road celebrating the achievements of young people who are in our care, and the way in which other partners support, for instance, our foster families in the city. Last Christmas I had the absolute joy of joining foster families at a Christmas film that was put on by the Hyde Park Picture House as one of our child-friendly Leeds ambassadors, with refreshments provided by another one of our child-friendly Leeds ambassadors from the White Rose shopping centre, and the way in which those types of events ensure that those children in our care and the families that take them into their homes and into their hearts and support them are made to feel valued is actually almost impossible to put on paper and to evaluate in the way in which that's actually changing people's lives and improving the quality of their lives and ensuring that they know that here in Leeds they are valued and supported. And I just would recommend that we all celebrate together how far we've come and how far there is still to go, but actually that we're heading in the right direction and we've got a lot of support from across the city to achieve that ambition.
Okay, thank you. Can we note the recommendations, approve the recommendations even, and move on to Councillor Yeadon's portfolio, item 9.
Thank you very much. This paper is a progress report from a paper that was brought to Executive Board in February 2016 regarding the development of a district heating network, and it is to seek approval to move forward with the district heating network, harnessing the energy or the heat from the recycling energy recovery facility and linking up a number of private and public customers through the city. Obviously, district heating networks are relatively common in cities across Europe and closer to home in Sheffield and Nottingham, and I think this scheme would go a considerable way in working towards the city's ambitions around low carbon and addressing fuel poverty. If you look at 3.13, you'll see the number of high-rise blocks which we would wish to link into the district heating scheme. Obviously, the first phase of the network would only harness, I think, 16% of the heat load that would be coming from the Earth, which gives further opportunity to develop the network through the city, and could be a considerable game changer in terms of establishing a low carbon heat source. Obviously there's there is a lot of detail in the pink papers because of the commercially sensitive nature of the report, so I'm sure we'll pick those up later, but happy to take questions or comments on the paper in the white bit.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you.
Yes, it's a highly ambitious scheme, and it doesn't come without significant risk, and just does concern me. There are confidential papers, obviously, on which we can comment further, but the history of district heating schemes in this country, up until fairly recently, with possibly a couple of exceptions, has not been a happy one, and indeed in this city it wasn't a particularly happy one in the past. I think of Hope Park as an example. And I understand why you need to move fairly quickly. But initially we looked at a financial model that had the combined authority putting significantly more funding in than is now currently proposed. I recall at the initial papers it was something like 10 million in one way or another, and it's now reduced to 4 million of grant in the white papers from the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. We're required to put in over 17 million of prudential borrowing, and also then through the housing revenue account over 11 million of capital. And yet when you look at the amount of business already signed up, and stop me if I'm straying into the pink, then we've a long way to go before it actually does what we intend it to do. And there's a particular point about signing up additional customers and saying that we have planning powers so that new developers would be obliged to sign up their estates to this scheme. But of course the caveat on that is only if it's more competitive than any alternative. And I'd like some assurances around that, please. I appreciate that we're talking about fixing a price for a very long time, something again which is interesting to say the least. So I have my concerns. It's a multi-million-pound project, and by the report's own admission there is a series of risks in here. I'm not entirely sure that we're not being over-optimistic, to put it bluntly.
Do you want to come back first? Or should, yeah. Yeah, first.
Well, if I just can cover off a few points. So, in relation to the change position in terms of the WICA grant and loan, initially the power plant was due to be built within the enterprise zone, and therefore they were to be in receipt of the non-domestic rates which associate with that. And therefore the proposed deal was that in return for a larger sum they would actually get the non-domestic rates which would repay that. Now actually the power plant is to be based around Saxton Gardens, and therefore the non-domestic rates are returning to us. So whilst we haven't included that within the business plan, that makes a very substantial difference in terms of the way that's handled. In terms of a couple of other points, I mean, you're right. I think you remember the Holt Park one, but I think Councillor Eden has mentioned Sheffield and Nottingham, and the company that we are engaged have a strong track record within this country of successful development of district heat. So we're not dealing with a new technology, and we're not dealing with a firm that hasn't developed very successful schemes in the past. In relation to the business case, you're right that at this moment in time there is an element of risk. That is not unusual. When district heating schemes are started, it's difficult to actually sign everybody up before the actual networks actually exist. But we've already seen strong interest on a purely commercial basis in what is being offered. And if we look at the development of the South Bank and the development of the city centre and the around 14,000 plus units which are proposed for that area, there is a huge area of potential through which to actually sell this scheme. And as Councillor Yeadon said, at the moment we're only using around about 16% of the energy. We're not that far off breaking even. Under the scenarios you'll see in the pink papers, there are relatively modest amounts we have to get to actually win in order to turn it into a profitable enterprise.
Thank you, Neil. Councillor Eden, do you want to come in?
Thank you. I think it is an ambitious scheme, and it's right that we are ambitious, but it's also right that we don't move forward with any unnecessary risks. And so I think Neil is going to be ensuring that before the scheme finally goes ahead, that all those risks are looked at and that the business plan is fully there. There are a lot of opportunities through this scheme, and the paper talks about ensuring that when we put in the infrastructure for this, we also look at infrastructure for high-speed broadband, and there are other potentials, particularly when we're going into our high-rises and looking at what other infrastructure we're able to do at the same time. And moving forward, local authorities are now having to look at ways that we can generate income, and if this scheme works in the way that we're hopeful it can, it could be a way of generating income for the future. So the energy from waste facility is there. We are already gaining electricity power over 22,000 homes, but there is still more energy generation that we can make from that, and it's really important that we make full potential from that, and I think this scheme will do that, as well as dealing with our ambitions around low carbon and tackling fuel poverty.
Councillor Galton.
Helpful suggestion, I hope, Chair. It is very ambitious. There is significant risk that we'll discuss in the pink papers. One thing I did note when I had my briefing was that we do intend to be setting the tariffs for this locally, and also the billing and customer service operation. And I just think it was a pity that this couldn't have been introduced at the same time as White Rose Energy, where you will appreciate that the jobs involved in that fuel poverty scheme are actually in Nottingham and not in Leeds. And hopefully, if we do set up a billing operation, maybe it could be brought back.
Neil, do you?
Will be we've tried to take advantage in terms of the White Rose with a larger scale piece of work which is going country-wide. I think this probably will be a different type of initiative, more aimed at kind of commercial users and big landlords.
Polly, do you want to add anything, or particularly? No, you're okay. Okay. That's fine. Good, okay. Thank you for that. Can we note the recommendations and subject to the pink paper discussion that we have coming up after the meeting going forward? Thank you. That moves on to my portfolio, item 10, and the first item on that is the West Yorkshire Joint Services Trading Company proposal. I've been asked to say that I don't actually need to declare an interest in this, although I do have a place on the Joint Services Board. Councillor Pauline Graham, who is in the room, substitutes at that meeting on my behalf, and particularly at the one where this was discussed a few months ago. I think we all know that the joint services have a really long and proven track record in terms of generating income in the marketplace, and the levels of income are going up by around 6.8% on an annual basis, so quite a successful operation, to the extent that out of 3 of the 4 areas that are covered, the work can no longer be provided under the Local Authority General powers to trade under the legislation, and this therefore brings forward a proposal that is going to all of the West Yorkshire authorities to establish a local authority trading company, as you will see described in the report. It's here for approval. I hope you've had the opportunity to look at it in some detail, but Doug is ably on hand to answer any of the technical questions that you might raise. Councillor Carter.
I'm glad you didn't say that Bradford, Kirklees and Calderdale had already agreed the paper, because that wouldn't necessarily mean I was any more confident than I was to start with. But again, I've got concerns about this. I wonder, have we taken our own legal advice, or are we relying on West Yorkshire Joint Services? What worries me about things, I understand the constraints there are, and the trading's been successful, and I'm perfectly happy with that. No, it's not a problem. I wonder whether there weren't other ways of dealing with it without having to resort to forming a trading company. And what reassurance are you going to give me that if it becomes a trading company, we're going to have the same political oversight, or even oversight as regards our senior officers are concerned, of what it's actually doing that we have now? Because again, experience tells me that when local authorities enter into this sort of agreement, the first thing that happens is elected members in the constituent authorities find out less and less about what's actually happening, and bit by bit it gets forgotten until there's an almighty blow up, some sort of loss of public funding, and all of a sudden everybody's saying, why did we do this? So I want some reassurances on this. I also note the scant comments there are in the various analyses that they've gone into on pages 330, 331 about possible tax liabilities, and whether we as an authority have independently looked at what that might involve.
Doug, can I bring you?
I think just sort of picking up the issues you've raised in terms of what we've looked at. Certainly I think it's Wakefield who's really taken the lead in terms of assessing those particular aspects really, and certainly in terms of the tax side, and clearly there is a potential issue there if surpluses are to be made. I think certainly Wakefield are very conscious of the need to ensure that they do look at some arrangements whereby that doesn't become the potential issue. I think in terms of the legal aspects, I don't know whether or not Catherine's able to comment further in terms of whether or not we would agree with the legal view that's been taken.
I think it's, as Doug said, it's fair to say that Wakefield have taken the lead on both the finance and on the legal. At various parts of this process, during various parts of this process, the constituent authorities, including Leeds, have been asked to feed in comments on the various legal aspects, and we've done that. So we are aware and are comfortable, but we haven't obviously gone into it in, I think, the same detail as perhaps Wakefield have.
Tom, please.
I think 3 years ago, I think it was, we were, I think, concerned at leader and chief exec level that we maybe weren't as together with the West Yorkshire Joint Services as we should be in terms of knowing what was going on and maybe delivering the savings that we had all had to do as constituent authorities. And then there was a couple of changes made at an officer level, and I think we're much more comfortable and confident now working with elected members who are on the board, that we're in a position where we're much happier, as you said, about the work that's going on. It isn't something that's come forward and just been accepted. There has been quite a debate within the chief execs and leaders to get this right in terms of the powers that are necessary. And I think what I'm sure would be easy to arrange would be a regular feedback, if you like, about how this is progressing. Maybe an annual report back to exec board. Certainly at chief exec level we'll be having regular updates from Susan Betteridge, who's in charge of it from the CEO side over there, to make sure, as you say, that this continues to be in line with what we've agreed and doesn't try and overreach itself. It's something that we have been very sort of aware of and want to keep an eye on. So if you wanted to agree today that you would get those regular assurances, I'm sure it would fit in with what we're planning to do at a West Yorkshire level anyway.
Just to say, Susan Betteridge comes to brief the leaders at the West Yorkshire leaders, and these concerns have been raised, but I think it's a fair comment that we have a report coming back to give us the reassurance that we're on the right track, if that is something that you would like to see going forward.
It's essential.
Okay.
But I'm voting against it.
Okay. With those comments, can we agree the recommendations? Okay, thank you. And move on to item 11, which is the cultural strategy, which we have discussed many times at executive board level, but also most of us have engaged with the conversations that have taken place in putting the strategy together. And the strategy is here to cover the period of 2017 to 2030. I think really there hasn't been a fully accepted recognition of the role that culture plays in contributing to so many of the activities that we consider at the executive board, and I think the strategy is a very welcome update, really, to enable us all to make sure that culture is placed at the heart of all our policy making decisions. I think we've talked a great deal about the contribution of culture to the economy, but I'm not sure that we really fully understand the contribution to areas of health and well-being, areas of child-friendly city, for example, the community strength that we have in culture going forward, and you'd be aware of the many comments that we don't want a strategy document that sits on a shelf and isn't implemented. And I think this is a tremendous piece of work, pulling together the many different strands of conversation that have taken place over the last year and a half, I think. Clooney is here. I don't know, Clooney, if you would like to add any more as we consider the item.
Thank you. Only briefly to say that it is the strategy, and just to remind members of the next steps is the creation of an action plan that delivers that, and we'll start that work early in the autumn to populate what are now a set of aims and objectives and values with detailed planning and programming, not just from the City Council but right across from third sector, from business, from individuals across the whole city.
Councillor Carter?
Yes. I mean, a thorough and effective cultural strategy has to be interlinked to a thorough and effective economic strategy, because the one thing you missed out just then was that if the cultural strategy is effective, it has a very positive effect on the economic strategy of the city. And even at its
one of the main points that I made,
No, I
about the recognition of the links to the economic performance of the city are one
sorry,
area that are discussed
I'm sorry,
in great
I should
length.
listen more carefully to you. Maybe. Now you've put me off. But more, which is unusual. More particularly, it's interesting when you drill the cultural strategy down to what happens out of the city centre. It also has a significant, and we heard about this last Wednesday, a significant impact on more localised cultural activities, like the West Indian Carnival, where there's been this not insignificant amount of economic activity generated in an area of Leeds which needs it because of a cultural event which has now become world famous. So I go back to what I said to begin with. This needs linking very carefully and thoughtfully to the economic strategy of the city, because there's benefits to be gained on all sides.
Okay, with those comments... Oh, sorry, Councillor Galton.
Yes,
sorry, apologies.
Yes, well, I'm fully signed up. I believe 2023 is a great thing. It's the next paper. Don't want to go and veer too much into that. However, you do say an action plan is following. It really does need to follow very quickly, because at its conceptual stage here, it's not a very usable document. And if we're going to say things like we're going to place culture at the heart of all future major policy decisions, we need to make people making those decisions in other areas other than culture know what that looks like. And that's quite a lot of work to get that on paper. So sooner rather than later, please, Clooney.
Just to reassure all members around the table that the approach to this has been to go out into communities and talk to people out in the communities, and I think that's a really exciting linkage across to the Capital of Culture bid going forward. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But in the meantime, can we agree the recommendations and look forward with anticipation to the action plan coming forward in due course? Thank you. So moving on, I think many of you, if we look at item 12, this is just by way of an update report. Many of you will be aware that on Friday there was a gathering down at the Tetley to mark the 100 days until the bid has to be submitted at the end of October. So the clock is really well and truly ticking on the bid going forward, and I'm delighted to note the contributions from so many people across the city and the excitement and enthusiasm that has been generated through the process to date. And I just think it's important always to note the extraordinary diversity of our city, and its diversity in terms of the people that live here, but also the geography, the locations, the fact that we have small villages as well as towns, as well as the inner city areas, and each area is unique in so many ways. And you just talk to people who come from particular areas of the city, and they will just say that they come from that particular area rather than saying Leeds first. So a huge amount of work happening at the moment. I think, Clooney, if you could just give us an update on the actual process that we need to go through to make sure that we get to the submission date with a fully populated document and the best possible bid that we can put forward on behalf of the city.
I certainly can. So the process from now, it's actually 100 days to go on Wednesday. So that's the point at which our marketing campaign kicks in again, particularly to get a significantly more and louder set of public support across the city, even though we've been very well supported to date. The two main things that are happening at the moment. One is we've got to write our application, and that's an 80-page document comprising 52 questions. So we're all buried deeply in writing those at the moment, and also developing a proposed artistic programme for 2023. As part of the application process, you have to suggest about half of the programme that you would promote. We're doing that following a call out for ideas. We had about 300 ideas that came back, and we're kind of in the middle of filtering through them, making sure they deliver on the aims and ambitions and the criteria indeed for the bid. As we go forward then, the anticipation, as it says in the paper, is that the final bid will come to Executive Board in October for approval. We then submit it shortly after that. All bidding cities then attend an interview with the panel of European judges. That's likely to happen in mid to late autumn. As a shortlisting process, assuming we're then shortlisted, you get another few months and actually another 20 pages of bid book to hone your application and to respond to any feedback from the panel. So the main activity at the moment is just getting that bid book right, and also starting the marketing campaign a bit more publicly from Wednesday.
Okay, happy. Okay, can we agree the recommendations? Thank you, Clooney. And we're moving on then to item 13, which is an update on our grants to arts and cultural institutions. I think it would be appropriate to welcome the refresh of the Arts Council policy towards grants going out, and the new chief executive, the chair. I'm looking at Clooney here. Yes, the chair, who's determined to make sure that more grant aid goes out around the regions and isn't just focused on the capital bids going forward. And the first round certainly seems to demonstrate that there has been a shift, which we can all welcome. And by way of complementing that, we have an update paper on the revised 4-year Arts at Leeds programme before you. There is actually a typo on page 417 under the paragraph 2.96, and the last line of that should read financial investment is between 4,000 to 50,000 rather than the 30,000 that's in the paper. Happy to open up for discussions and comment. I'm taking it that they're both happy. Clooney, is there anything that you need to add? Can we agree the recommendations? Okay, thank you very much. And moving on then to the last item on page 431, the inclusive growth strategy. This is a paper to alert us to the fact that we're about to go out to consult on the Leeds inclusive growth strategy. I hope you'll agree that the detail within the document is very far-reaching and should generate a great deal of comment coming back, which we will be doing everything we can to make sure that the document reaches right out into the widest possible number of people for comment. But happy to take any comments if there are any at the moment. Councillor Galton.
The West Yorkshire Combined Authority is also interested in inclusive growth, so it's not just a Leeds concern. It's hoped to be spread out across a sub-region. It can be very wide-ranging as to what you include in your growth strategy, but I do think we need to be very careful about specifics. And what I will say is, when you're inclusive, you make sure that it's the entire city which is being involved. And so I point towards section 5 as a key area for measurement of this for communities such as those which I represent in my ward. It talks about supporting places and communities to respond to economic change. In particular, it talks about priority neighbourhoods. Different neighbourhoods can be prioritised for different strands, I would suggest, as opposed to the usual money going into the usual places. So that's just a plea for some of the outlying areas. It talks about building more homes. We've already had that debated as to how much of that investment actually comes back into the city when homes are built, depending on whether or not you have very large developers or whether you have locally based building firms doing the building. But of particular interest to us, I think, is the transforming the role of town centres as economic and service hubs and making assets work to support growth and communities. We have actually got a very good track record under the last joint administration and this current administration in terms of supporting town and district centres to be more vibrant trading environments. We are in danger of falling down on the last bullet point, though, on page 486, as a lot of those assets which are very valuable to some communities are very busily being sold off by the council's asset management team. So we shouldn't be fulfilling one financial imperative at the risk of undermining a stated ambition in another council strategy.
Tom, do you want to comment other than this is a consultation document and we'd be happy to receive your comments going forward? I think that's the main message. I don't know if Tom, if you want to add anything at this point.
The only thing I'd add is clearly inclusive growth is a big topic, and what we've tried to do is identify some specific proposals here. We recognise that through the consultation process we've got some work to do to drill down into some of the detail around what that will mean in terms of things being done differently. We've also sought, and there's some commitments set out in the document, we've asked businesses, universities, schools in the city, what is it that they're going to do and what is it they can either continue to do or do differently to promote inclusive growth. And we want to use the consultation phase to seek more of those specific commitments so that we make it not just a strategy, we actually turn it into action as well.
Tom?
Yeah, I spent, it seems like most of my life trying to write or implement these sort of strategies. And I think this is a really good piece of work. Tom and the team should be really commended for it. I think it's very clear and it genuinely tries to move on from, I think, just a standard approach to economic development. It has some things in it which are really interesting challenges about pay, low pay, where you put development, how you take advantage of development that's happening in certain parts of the city, how you make sure that skills is much more central to your economic strategy rather than an attachment to it, and also how we link into our neighbours, because there are other similar pieces of work going on in our neighbouring authorities, and there was a really good session that I think Councillor Lewis was involved in and others around how we link up with Bradford, for example. So I think this is a really, really good thing to go out and consult on, and I think there's a lot of scepticism out there about whether inclusive growth is just in a way, an excuse to get away with just doing the economic development that we've always done in the past. That's not Leeds. That's nationally. There's quite a debate going on, and people, don't have easy answers to these issues. And I think, this strategy starts to bring out what they might be. On Councillor Galton's point, I think that's just the sort of point that needs to be debated in the consultation process. I think there are different views about what sort of assets make a real difference at that local level, which ones need to stay in the council and which ones can we let go of, and how do we take advantage of the fact that we're the biggest landowner, procurer of services, employer in the city, even more than we do now. So I think just, this is going to be a really live debate and one that I think we can be right at the forefront of if we get this right.
I think the important thing to note as well is how it links with other key strategies, and it's really important that we don't become very repetitive, but there is an assumption that we will have the close links with the transport strategy, and Councillor Carty will be very pleased to see links with the cultural strategy as well. But also I think the other issue is the national push on the industrial strategy, and I think it's really important that we link with that. And I think the aspect of the inclusive growth side, actually getting underneath some of the issues around productivity and why is it that productivity is lower in our region as a whole. And there is a piece on culture in the strategy, but I think one of the important aspects that sometimes gets overlooked is that assets are not just about land and buildings, they're also about people and how we maximise opportunities for everyone living and choosing to come and work in our city. So look forward very much to a high level of engagement in this going out, and to it coming back with those comments included to a future executive board. So with that, could we move the recommendations, please, and move on to the next portfolio? Councillor Rafiq.
Thanks, Chair. This is the annual reporting of progress made against equality improvement priorities, which we are also legally bound to report on an annual basis. Members will report that note that on pages 530 and 531 from 4.2 to 4.7 it lists some of the refreshed priorities by some of the directors, namely city development, resources and housing, health, and a completed priority by city development, and there's a couple of new priorities as well. On the whole, I think the refresh alterations allow the priorities to be more focused on individuals and groups of people who disproportionately suffer inequalities, and ensure our work meets the needs of the people who need it in the most, and often find themselves on the periphery of all types of growth in the city. So, as I said, this is an annual report, but next year will be the actual priorities are from 2016 to 2020. Next year will be halfway through, and we will see a fundamental review of the priorities. So, happy to take any comments. I'll stop there, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, happy to support. Okay, thank you very much. Very, very comprehensive. Can we agree the recommendations, please, and move on to Councillor James Lewis's portfolio, please?
I'll just reshuffle my stacks of paper. This is the first paper on mine, is the medium-term financial strategy, which is sort of the first part of the budget setting for the next financial year. I know you can always tell when someone's coming because they start talking about next year's budget with the so we've sort of brought the medium-term financial strategy forward, which doesn't yet get into the detail of some of the work we need to do to prepare next year's budget, but it does talk about some of the latest estimate on both our income, on changes to the financial position, the impact of some of the changes we took in this year's budget that will flow through the lifetime of this financial plan, and then identifies the gap that we need to find in terms of savings for the next few years' budget. Obviously, some of this we are in a 4-year settlement with the government. Obviously, at the time, I think all of us agreed that there wasn't enough money, but what it does give us is some certainty on the envelope of funding we get from central government. So that has given us some abilities to predict a little bit further forward. And then, given the change that happened at the general election, we now know that 100% business rate retention isn't going to go ahead, although we anticipate that the fair funding review that will sat alongside that will still be going ahead, and of course we will be engaging with that when we get the opportunity.
Okay, any comments? No? Okay, that's fine. Can we move can we agree with the recommendations and move on to your next item, please, item 17?
My next item feels a bit like Doctor Who regenerating. You come round to the every year we have the financial health monitoring every year, and every year we have a slightly different approach. But this is the first quarter of the current year, 17-18, which sets out the position as things are at the moment. Obviously, the information is all there. I don't think there's a lot more that needs to be said on this report.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Carter?
Just one comment, and it's the obvious one, obviously, that children and families in the first quarter report is indicating an overspend of almost £3 million. Now, last Wednesday we tried to, at the council, which is an almost impossible task really, to get some sort of sensible debate about the budgeting in children's services. And let me make it clear, I am not saying that we should not be spending this money. That's not that at all. What I'm saying is, why on earth, for the third year running, haven't we been told when we set the budgets that one department simply could not function as it needed to function on the budget that was being set? It's a nonsensical situation. Basically, all this, as far as I can tell, amounts to placements outside of the local authority, which are, it would, absolutely necessary, and no one's suggesting that they aren't made. What I'm saying is that, for heaven's sake, when we move into the budget discussions and we move into the budget presentations for the next financial year, tell it as it is. If that's what it's going to cost, well, the administration, and to a lesser extent, but the opposition as well, then have to look at it as it really is, and not as somebody signs off and says it is, and then 3 months later it isn't. I mean, that is just not acceptable in any situation. As I say, if that's what it costs, that's what it costs. But let's have an honest debate about it and know that's where we are to start with, because it means decisions need making elsewhere. That's all we're saying. But this is the third year running, and in no other walk of life, nowhere would that be deemed sensible. We have to talk about the facts as they are, the financial pressures as they are, and the finance that is needed, not come along 3 months into it and say, well, actually, we were wrong. And I know it's demand-led, and I know sometimes it's difficult, but it isn't that much, and we need to have that sensible debate.
Mr. Galton.
Well, it's just following the same line. We had this debate in full council, so won't retread it all over again. It is just after that admission that, actually, given the really very professional service that we have in children's services and looked after children, the accredited, Ofsted-approved thresholds that we have, we recognise all those, and those are positive things. We also need to perhaps recognise that actually there is, because of the nature of society, a sort of natural demand that we will always need to look after, and that we cannot always be hopeful that the numbers will drop. If we're hopeful that the numbers will drop, it needs to be a little bit more realistic. But also, we might also be able to then look at solutions that mean that we're far more in control of them locally. So, for instance, some of these placements for young people that necessarily at the moment need to be made elsewhere, we should really be taking on the responsibility of finding some kind of joint residential solution, perhaps locally, so that they are far nearer to families and friends and institutions where they can be better educated, take advantage of all that money that's been spent recently on the SEMH facilities, for instance. I really do think we need to have that fresh look, and I join Councillor Carter in that call for transparency and realism.
That's the point. It may be that that we have to have these outside placements, because it would actually cost us more to try and look after these very complex needs amongst this group of young people in-house. It may be that's the case. What we're saying is we don't actually know, because no one's done the exercise, and clearly you don't know because you can't be happy that that's what gets reported back. So all we're saying is, come on, let's just have a look at whether this is actually what we need to spend, and if it is, it is, or whether we should be looking at some further in-house provision to provide some of these very complex resolutions to these cases. And what I'm saying, and I guess Stuart's saying as well, is clearly that debate has not been had, and that discussion has not been had.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you. I think we did have a debate in Council last week about this, and I think Stuart pretty much gave us a speech all over again. I do think it is, is it a satisfactory position we find ourselves in? No, it is not, and I don't think we would ever say that. Clearly, we spent a substantial amount of time working with the DFE. There's extra money coming specifically around this. We will, as we've promised in the past, come back in the autumn with a report that not just notes how much money has come in, about how we are going to spend that money. I think we all agree on this one. We will come back with a clearer, more detailed explanation of how not just that money's been injected into the budget, which we've already agreed, but specifically how it can achieve some of the things that we've talked about. So I don't want, in bringing this paper, I don't want to say it's a position that we find acceptable, or it's a position we're not prepared to do anything about. I think, again, I don't want to go back through the whole council debate from last week, but the one salient factor for me is that 90% of authorities responsible for children's services are overspend in this area, and I think there's probably, if there's something that we could do between us as local government, it is trying to get to grips with some of the reasons that this area is, in terms of demand, is hard to predict. I don't think we'd argue with that.
Okay, with that reassurance, can we agree the recommendations and move on to item 18?
Yes, thank you. Item 18 is the investment of the Strategic Infrastructure Fund, Leeds Community Infrastructure Levy. This is a report that asked us to agree what, in terms of the I think £80 million demand for new school places, inject £600,000 towards that as part of the strategic SIL fund. I think it's a fairly straightforward paper that asks us to agree that investment.
Councillor Galton.
Thanks, Chair. This very area of spend actually brings up an area of concern for me as a local member in terms of transparency of development-based income coming into the council. I recently had a case where there was a development in my area. Section 106 payment was taken for education purposes. They were supposed to be for young people that lived on that estate. It just so happened that one of the families that moved into that estate and whose children now go to one of our local schools is a person who was employed by that development company. He asked whether the school had seen any of that money, and they said no. And then when we went to our education department and asked for it, they said, well, it's not yours really. So there is a bit of an issue here about transparency, about what money is associated with what kind of spend and who decides when and where it gets spent. And I'm afraid that the Community Infrastructure Levy, although it allows people pretty high up in the council, at the senior level, to make big strategic decisions like this, to inject a big amount of money into school places, which is, of course, one of the biggest pressures on the council, it actually also diminishes the level at which it's transparently corresponded back down to the areas where these developments have taken place. And I think we really do need to have a supplementary paper on this in terms of how we inject some of that transparency into that spending.
We have the similar pressures in Kippix and Methley Ward as well, and I think the community infrastructure level has added another level of complexity to planning agreements. I think it is fair to say, obviously, the strategic fund is only one element of money you would sort of lump together as planning gain. Again, I've had similar discussions with people in my ward about this. I think we are happy for Children's College to correct me. I think Kippix is one of the few areas in the city where we don't have pressure on school places. But there has been but we have had people on new housing developments saying, well, there's a new housing development coming up. Why is it money coming in? And the school places are currently available. So I don't think it would be the intention to build places where they are not available. Clearly, like I say, SIL is only one part of a myriad of things that come forward from developments, but I tend to agree that sometimes it can be confusing, and obviously we're agreeing a lump sum here from the strategic SIL amount, and there's a lot more work to be done in terms of how that both are linked to developments, and not every, the impact of housing developments isn't just felt in the immediate area around housing developments. More people move into houses in Kippix. They'll drive through Councillor Cooper's ward to get into Leeds, for example. That's what the strategic fund is attempting to deal with, along with other things.
Okay. Let's turn off now.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Can we agree the recommendations of the paper and move on to item 19?
Item 19, Chair, is the annual corporate risk management report, which brings forward to Executive Board the Council's risk register. This isn't the only place that members engage in the Council risk register. It's not like a document, talking about one document earlier, it's not like it comes to this board. We agree annually and it disappears. There's lots of other places that members are involved in considering the risks and challenging them, and that's set out in paragraph 3.6. In addition, I can see Councillor Pauline Graham here, and Chair of the Resources and Strategy Scrutiny Board, and on Friday we're looking at the City's response to major incidents, which obviously there's been a number that have perhaps brought that into sharp relief. I know there's a paper on later about Grenfell Tower, but also the terrorist attacks in Manchester, where as we felt in Leeds some both in terms of community cohesion, in terms of victims and people who were affected who were Leeds based, that was something that needed to respond to, and also again this sort of reflects some of the cyber security issues as well that could disrupt life in the city. Quite often I think when there is disruption to life in the city, it does show that the council, whether we are the fourth emergency service or not, I don't know, but certainly local authorities are the glue that holds the glue that can hold things together, and also, as Councillor Eden knows better than probably any of us, when Kirkstall flooded, it's a council that can quite often provide an immediate response, coordinate responses by other agencies, volunteers and everybody else who's involved and affected by that. So, like I say, this comes forward this year. I think it's very timely, given some of the things we've seen, and appropriate that we do continue to consider how, as a local authority, we can help support and respond when there is major disruption in the city.
One very brief point. We're going to continue with the leaders' briefings on the risk assessments, presumably, which have been very useful over the years, I have to say.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Okay, can we agree the recommendations? Move on to your last paper.
Thank you. The last paper is the Best Council Plan Annual Performance Report, which is a veritable cornucopia of information about what's happening in the city. It's set out like this. We've been asked to consider it before it's sort of turned into artwork. It is very, very text heavy and covers all sorts of things, life in the city and looks. I think the challenge always with this is about understanding, is about understanding the impact that we can have on life in the city, where we want to have that impact. Do we understand what impact we're having, and how do we look at where we want to move forward in the future? So we quite often debate, do we put, quite often debate about how much or how little we put in. I mean, my view is it's sort of trying to set out across a whole range of areas. Also gives a little bit of a picture about perhaps how things sit together, not just how individual areas where we achieve well, or some of the things that we're very candid about where we're not seeing the progress we'd like around, particularly around sort of some of the deep-seated areas of poverty and inequality in the city. So it is, it is an annual report that comes forward, and I'm sure there'll be some comments on it coming forward.
Councillor Goldson.
Thanks, Chair. I was interested in that last comment from Councillor Lewis about being candid about areas that you weren't particularly performing well in, because actually this report just seemed like a great tick list of good things, but not really. It's got limited value in terms of assessing performance. And I understand it's supposed to be this year's, or 2016 to 17, but it's still including things like opening the A65 quality bus corridor, which I seem to remember had a Liberal Democrat minister at its official opening, which just shows how long ago it was. So I'm just like to be, I'm interested in where the candid bits are, because I didn't find it when I have to admit, my speed reading of this document. So yeah, a little bit more of an understanding of the challenges would be welcome here.
Okay, I think we've understood what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, can we agree the recommendations and look forward to the colourful version coming forward? And move on now to the next portfolio area, and we'll take the additional paper that's been circulated as your first item, Councillor Cooper.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The first item is an update on the tragic events that happened at Grenfell Tower. There is a lot of detail already in the report, and I don't intend to take a long time refreshing members' minds, because we have discussed this on a number of occasions now. So if I can just start by saying that we're working in close partnership with West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service along all of our response to this event that happened at Grenfell. And obviously our first priority was the safety of our citizens, and so an immediate review of our blocks took place. We have 116 high-rise blocks, and 23 of them are clad. And I must say that none are of the aluminium composite material of the type that was found in London. And we are not required to take out any further testing by the government. However, we are going to make sure that further testing takes place, so that we can reassure our tenants and residents who live in those blocks that it is absolutely safe for them. We have contacted all tenants and residents in our multi-stories on a number of levels, by letter, by leaflet. We've held engagement sessions in each and every one of our blocks. And the feedback that's come back from tenants and residents, I have to say, is that they do feel reassured from our contact as a council with them, to be there to answer any queries, issues that they have immediately, and be able to put their minds at rest. I do have to say we have invested an awful lot of money, over £10 million in the last 3 years, on fire safety and precautions. We've invested heavily on compartmentalisation. I always get this word wrong, Neil, don't I? Compartmentation. There you go. Which is designed to stop the spread of fire. And in Leeds, we have had success in that it seems to have worked so far. And in fact, we've had a fire since the events in London, and it didn't actually spread any further than the seat of the fire. We have a number of our blocks that we have retrofitted sprinkler systems to, and they are our sheltered blocks. We have 5 already in place and a further 3 that are due to take place over the next year. And we are considering how we may roll that out further into other blocks that might be necessary. But we are looking to government for some guidance on that and a national strategy, because we do believe that that's needed. There are over 4,000 blocks in the UK, multi-storey blocks in the UK, and so it would be useful for the government to have a national strategy to let local authorities know how they'd like us to prioritise which blocks, when and where, and how the industry has got the capacity to perhaps deliver that as well. Moving on to the private sector now, Leeds has approximately 150 private high-rise buildings, some of which are in cladded material. And so again, we've been working with West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service on this, and we've been contacting owners and managers to ensure their buildings are safe and any cladding is to be tested. So we've taken an inventory of all high-rise buildings, and we've had feedback on some government testing that a number of private buildings have actually failed the government testing. But I believe that the test that they failed was the first test that they were supposed to have. The government's changed the way it's testing this material now. So they will be undergoing the new testing, which I think we all have a lot more faith in the new way of testing. We've also engaged with all of our schools, all of the hospitals and the universities to help liaise with them and the people that use those buildings as well. And I'd just, Chair, if you'd allow me, finally like to make some thanks to our officers and staff who have gone out to speak to tenants and residents throughout, the 24 hours a day, I've got to say, in dealing with this as an emergency when it happened. Without them and their efforts, we wouldn't be in such a great position that we are in Leeds City Council today. So, Neil, if you'd pass those thanks on to all your staff, would appreciate it, and any other frontline staff that have taken calls on this as well. I'll leave it there for any questions, Chair.
Thank you very much for the update, and I think if you could pass on the thanks from all of Executive Board. I think the response has been phenomenal, and Councillor Cooper, I know you've put a lot of hours into supporting the staff as well in your role as Executive Member, so thank you to you as well. But I think the major task of reassurance has been absolutely crucial, and I think actually having face-to-face meetings and going around personally and individually has been an extraordinary undertaking, but one that's been very well worthwhile. Councillor Carr.
Yes, I just echo what you've just said, Councillor Blake. Absolutely, it's been first class, so that's extremely reassuring to residents but also to elected members. Just one point, and this is an unfolding story, and so I'm not going to go on at any length at all, other than just to say, on the assessment of vulnerability and prioritisation of sprinkler systems in tower blocks, I take it we are looking at vulnerability of tenants wider than just age in some of the blocks, because what has become extremely apparent to me, and I'm sure everybody else, is that the residents in Grenfell Tower were a massive variety of different vulnerabilities and people who, for example, maybe would buy electrical appliances that a lot of us would say we're not touching that with a barge pole. And I'm not blaming them for that. I'm merely saying that's just the way of it. And I think it's important that we look at vulnerability in terms of tenants of our tower blocks across the piece.
I'm happy to give that reassurance to Councillor Carter that we are looking at the people who are living in our blocks as tenants about all their vulnerabilities and their accommodation needs within that as well, not just the vulnerabilities. So we'll be bringing further paper back to Executive Board with an action plan, I would imagine, and then a way of actually delivering that and implementing that as we go on.
I think it's fair to add as well that there's a really good piece of work going cross-party through the LGA in terms of the whatever comes out of the inquiry and a concerted continuing lobby to government that they have a responsibility in supporting us in any work that we need to do as a result of that of the inquiry as it goes forward. So thank you for bringing that. Can we note the recommendations and move on to your next item, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And item 21 is a strategic, coordinated and inclusive approach to migration in Leeds. And it's a shame that Councillor Anderson's had to leave by the look of things, because he was heavily involved in scrutiny board work and a working group inquiry into this. Which has ended up with this report, really, Chair. So I'd like to make sure my thanks go to him and his scrutiny board for all that work that they've carried out, and the recommendations that they've made, most of which are reflected in this Executive Board report. This paper sets out the arrangements for migration in the city. And as we all know, Executive Board, that we're a compassionate city with a strong economy, and we're also a city of sanctuary. As I've said, the Communities Scrutiny Board did a great deal of work on this, and the recommendations are reflected in here. We have the Leeds Strategic Migration Board that has been set up. We have the third sector leading a migration partnership. Amongst other things, there are a number of programmes underway, one of which I would like to flag up to you is the Migration Access Project, which has been an award-winning project that we have fantastic officers working on that as well. And their aim really is to relieve pressure on other services by making sure that any newcomers to the city have got the correct help and access to services that they need in the first place. So again, I don't intend to go on at length. The details in the report, and I assume members of Exec Board have read the report. I don't want to read it out to you.
I just say, Chair, that I think this report and the work that's been done reflects extremely well on the city, and the officers who've been involved, and the scrutiny committee has already been mentioned.
Thank you for those comments. Can we agree the recommendations and move on to item 22?
Thanks, Chair. Just shuffling my papers along again. So item 22 is the Council House Growth Programme and the delivery of extra care housing in the city. I'm really pleased to be introducing this report. I've got to say, on behalf of 3 portfolios and 3 directorates that have worked really closely and well together to get to this point. So the extra care housing that we're proposing in this report is part of a Better Lives programme, and Leeds has got a vision to work with partners to construct 1,000 new units of extra care homes. We know that there's a growing need for this type of housing, and the benefits of extra care living are really clear, and they include people keeping more independent, but also having the security of the care should they require it. So as part of the Council House Growth Programme, we're intending to invest £30 million in the development of extra care to enable an initial delivery of 200 council-owned units. And we hope that this investment will encourage a wider development of extra care across the city. The sites have been identified which follow best practice design criteria, and Table 2 on page 788 shows the sites that have been shortlisted. And I do just have to put a caveat on that, because this is just the starter of this programme and the initial sites that we've shortlisted. It's not the end, it's not everything and the end of the programme. The report also sets out the procurement options, and we're aiming to offer 3 schemes for development to the market initially. So I'll leave it there, but hopefully other exec board members might want to come in to add to that.
Okay, Councillor Charwood.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks to Councillor Cooper for mentioning the joint work and the joint report there and the nature of this report. And I think it's just really worth mentioning at this stage how the Better Lives programme, changing social care and social care services and elderly care for the better, does involve changing services, and that sometimes involves closing services, but in this case it involves building new services and a new service design, which is very exciting. We need it in Leeds, there's demand for it, people like it. Elsewhere, people really, really value this sort of service, where people have more independence and have great, new facilities like we've seen at Wolfdale View. So, really welcome this report. It's really good to see good news and something coming forward.
Okay, I saw Councillor Galton first.
Well, I'm not quite so optimistic as Councillor Cooper about this. You might be surprised to hear. This £30 million fund first got mentioned in the budget back in February. And that fund was announced after a considerable debate over a good 12 months. In fact, the site of Windleswood Green that's in my own ward, which is mentioned in this paper, was being marketed for extra care housing at the time that Councillor Yeadon was in charge of adult social care. It soon became apparent that the private sector was not interested in delivering on that site, and that something needed to happen if the council was serious about building extra care housing as an alternative to the residential care that they were very busily withdrawing from. The fact that you've got to this stage after announcing this in February is appalling. In fact, rather than it being a marvellous example of 3 departments coming together to deliver on something that the council sees as a strategic priority, it actually just shows how ineffective they've been at getting together to get results on the ground. There are already 3 housing developments that I'm aware of, 2 of which I know that are in Wheatwood Ward, where the social housing aspect that was agreed as part of the planning process for those housing developments was the delivery of extra care housing. This strategy is supposed to be about engaging with the private sector to enable them to get their extra care housing off the ground if they don't feel it's financially viable through the use of the strategic fund. To my knowledge, those people who already have applications approved or have already had a relationship with the council have not had anybody approach them to talk to them about how this fund might enable them to deliver the extra care housing that's in place. This is not a good newspaper. It's very slow. Please quicken the pace. We need the extra care housing.
Councillor Carter.
Well, I was going to be very complimentary. In fact,
I'll make sure I call you.
I will be complimentary.
I'll make sure I always call you first, Andrew.
Well, that's your own fault, you see. Now, let that be a lesson to you, as they say. All right, you've got a point. But, February to to July. In the terms of local government, it's not slow. If you think that's slow, boy, you've not been round very long. I'll tell you slow. No, I won't, so I don't want to embarrass any of you. But I could. The first one I was going to make was I was glad that, Deborah, you mentioned that this was only the start, because I noticed that in Outer West there's nothing at all. We're the second area with the second highest area of deficit so I hope you're going to rectify that. It's interesting. I understand you're working with North Yorkshire or North Yorkshire districts who have got an excellent record and have moved things actually fairly speedily. I'll give you an example. In Thirsk there is a sizable private housing development being constructed. Off the back of that there is a significant development of extra care housing for elderly people, and that's nearly finished while they're still building the private houses. Now that's the key. That's the key for you. And it is a challenge, and that's to get the developers to move with the extra care housing, whether it's for rent or to buy, at a speed that's at least as good as the speed with which they're building out the private housing development adjacent or linked to. So that's the challenge, and it is a challenge. But I welcome this, and I hope now that it will move with some speed, and that we do try and actually achieve the totality of the vision, because it's absolutely needed. And it's by some flexibility in arrangements like set out in this paper, which I think we should welcome, that we're going to actually get there.
Okay, I don't know if you'd like to come back, Councillor Cooper.
Yes, it seems to me that Councillor Galton hasn't got election mode yet, Chair. But anyway, if he'd have taken time to read the detail of the paper, you know, we've done an awful lot of work, I've got to say, since February, around looking at different procurement approaches and how we might encourage the private sector to come forward by parcelling land up slightly differently, by looking at things in a different way. And I was going to finish off by saying, and still will, even if he wants to be a critical friend, offer actually that we might have a cross-party working group on how we take this forward. We absolutely do want to make sure that where there's a need for extra care in this city, it's not just about the council fulfilling extra care spaces, it's about working together and how we can get as many of those good quality spaces as possible in the city. And I'm happy to take forward a working group if the other parties would like us to do so in taking that forward, Chair.
Good, thank you. I, honestly, having been to visit the Wolfdale View, it is the future. It is such a statement of respect for older people in this city, and I look forward to many more examples around the whole of the city, and I think we've all got an interest in making sure that we are as proactive as we possibly can be to enable these developments to come forward. So thank you. Can we move the recommendations and move on to your last item, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Item 23 is the community-led local development paper, and this is the European Structural and Investment Funds ESIF programme that actually three local groups have won the right to be able to put in a bid for some money to bring into some of the poorest areas in our city and some of those most in need. So the three areas are, unsurprisingly, the inner east, the inner south and the inner west. And this paper is just asking Leeds City Council to act as the accountable body for those submitting those bids. It does mention just over £1,000 as well, but that's actually already been put in officer time. It's not actually in funds as such. Thanks, Chair.
Galton.
Just a passing comment. when I first saw the title of the paper, I did have my suspicions that it was going to be the usual suspects that were going to be benefiting from extra money, and the council was enabling them because that's what the council knows how to do. Actually, I was very encouraged when I had the briefing in terms of how this money is going to the right places. I just thought it was a bit of a shame that it takes the European Union to come up with a funding mechanism which is actually enabled to give fairly distribution of this kind to poorer neighbourhoods in the way that our own national government sometimes doesn't actually offer up. And all I will say is I hope that something useful comes up soon from Westminster in terms of giving this kind of leg up to some of our poorer communities.
Well, isn't it one of the biggest arguments in terms of repatriation of money from Europe out to the regions and not coming through Westminster? I think that's that's one of the arguments, isn't it, that we need to make sure is very, very hard fought as we go forward in the negotiations. Tom.
I was just going to agree with Councillor Galton's points about one element of the way the European Union works in terms of the structural funds, in the sense that it is very evidence-based, and it was quite a clear framework, clear accountability structures, and targeted on those areas of need. It fell down where it was overly bureaucratic and very much aimed at widget counting rather than outcomes. And I hope that when we do repatriate, we can keep the good things, but then improve the other bit. But it is an important point, because the Treasury, traditionally, under whichever colour of government, does not traditionally operate like that. It's not its natural way of working.
Good. Moving safely on. Oh, Councillor Cooper.
Well, you'll note in the first paragraph of the report, actually, Chair, that the Leeds City region has one of the largest allocations, actually, of ESIF funding as well, 340 million, so it would be nice to make sure that that carries on after the inevitable will happen.
Okay, can we agree the recommendations and move on to Councillor Richard Lewis's portfolio?
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. This is just a design and cost report for the refurbishment of the Playhouse. Report follows on from the one we had 2 years ago, where we agreed that effectively the council would take the lead on this work. Gives details of all the funding. I've certainly had the presentation on the vision for this, and I have to say that's really impressive. And you kind of think that perhaps there were many missed opportunities when the Playhouse was built. This puts right, but I think I don't think Chris is here, is it? But Martin can certainly answer any questions on the details of the proposals. But also say details of the funding and the bid for funding through Arts Council England.
Sorry, too much happening all at once at the moment. Councillor Casser first.
Yeah, just looking at the capital funding and cash flow, the budget seems to be reliant on about £3 million from the private sector. Some experience of these figures appearing in to estimates of this sort, and some experience of those figures then not being actually realised. If it's not realised, I take it that falls to us to pick up the shortfall. That said, I think it's right to be moving forward at this time on that site for all sorts of reasons, not least the fact you've got City of Leeds College about to start building on the site adjacent, and so there has to be some element of savings by having developments moving forward relatively side by side. I take it we're in charge of the project team for this as well.
Councillor Galton, do you want to come in?
I think we all welcome investment in the West Yorkshire Playhouse. So happy to approve this particular paper. What I do is make sure that our colleagues on the plans panel take this application seriously as well, because the artist's impressions... Has it gone through already?
It's gone through, hasn't it? Yeah. I thought it had. It's been passed.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's gone through Plans Panel as a pre-application, and members of Plans Panel indicated that they were happy for officers to deal with it under delegated powers.
Well, just on that point, the West Yorkshire Playhouse is a fantastic facility, and its two theatres are a real asset. What people will often comment on, though, is that it does look a bit like a municipal sports centre from the outside. So, if we are going to improve the capacity at the front, it also needs to be of a really decent quality. And I wouldn't like to think that the money is going to be stretched and that we don't get a good quality piece of architecture, because it is one of our key jewels in the crown, isn't it?
Yeah, Martin, do you just want to bring Councillor Galton up to speed, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, the architects chosen for this scheme were Park Page, who are a leading architecture firm in this type of building. The mix of the scheme is partially internal and about improving efficiency and access in the theatre and enhancements to the actual theatres themselves, but secondly also creating a new front for the theatre which will provide that much stronger vision of the facility as you approach it. And linked to that in the paper is also then the public realm that we're looking to bring forward as a separate paper in September, which is complementary to the new college facility coming forward. So the intention is that by the autumn of 2019 there will be a new front to the playhouse, there will be new public realm, and there will be a new college facility, which taken together will lead to a transformation of that site.
Yeah, and just can't emphasise enough how important it is to open up that site to the rest of the city, Victoria Gate, going forward. Okay, can we agree the recommendation, move on to the next item?
Item 25 just details how Health for All Leeds have got a large grant from the big lottery to redevelop Beeston Village Community Centre. What this proposes will actually enable a lot more facilities to be offered to the community by giving them a ground lease at a peppercorn rent.
Can we agree with the recommendations and move on to the last portfolio? Councillor Charlwood.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. If it's okay, I would invite Tony Cook to come and join the board. Tony is the Chief Officer that covers both this paper and the next paper, so it might be useful if he's needed for any particular question. So this paper is the Health and Care Plan, starting a conversation with citizens. I say starting a conversation, we have already had some conversation, as members on Exec Board will already know. The plan for the health and care system and the future of it in Leeds is sort of really placed within the health and wellbeing strategy that we're all aware of, but it's also going to be part of the Changing Leeds dialogue as well, which is set out in the paper. So it's starting a conversation with the public on the future of the health and care system, but in the context of the financial challenges that we have in that system and how we can work together to meet them, both meet the efficiency needs, but the demand pressures that are coming forward as well, which we need to meet. So we want, as an administration and as a Health and Wellbeing Board, to involve the people of our city at an early stage in how, before it's designed and as it's designed, all the way through, to make sure that we involve people and their views all the way through. And it's so the plan itself, which is there's a plan on a page inside the paper, is based on a sort of preventative and community-based model of health, but has key issues in it like parity of esteem for mental health and a recognition of the third sector and the community assets that we have, and also the sense of primary care and the transformation of primary care and how that can deliver efficiencies. There's also a big strand of digital innovation in the city as well, we should be really proud of, and that has great potential. So the paper is asking Executive Board to approve that this goes out for further work with the public, and notes some more detail will be forthcoming as plans are developed. I think at the moment it's a strong basis to work from, but noting it will change. And I would just draw members' attention to page 876, which details who has been consulted so far. So Health and Wellbeing Board, but Scrutiny Board, Forum Central, Health Watch, Youth Watch and Leeds Older People's Forum to date. But that will continue and be augmented and even more.
Thank you. Councillor Carter.
Just one point. How do we measure outcomes? How do we measure how successful this has been?
You want to come in, Councillor Golter? I mean, we've got quite a good methodology for measuring outcomes, but it depends. Some of them are, the softer they are, the harder they are to measure. But Tony's bursting to come in actually at the end. but that's been the basis of the transformation of children's services. How do we actually communicate how we're making progress? Tony, do you want to?
It is an absolutely central question, that one. There are 3 gaps that have been identified both by central government and by ourselves locally around health inequalities, health improvement, the quality of services and some of the financial gaps as well. So there are detailed plans in place for all of those. And probably the thing to comment on that most of all is that this plan is rooted in the health and wellbeing strategy that has been agreed and improved over the years. And it is rooted in linking it to things like the economic strategy, the growth strategy, the culture strategy. So it sees health as being created by how people live their everyday life. So whilst there are a whole load of indicators in there about things like premature mortality, which is essentially how people live, and making some progress on issues like cancer and heart disease. There's also that social picture of health as well, making sure people have got access to proper housing, proper advice, income. So it's a broad-facing approach really on indicators and more generally.
Paul wants to come in.
I was just going to add to what Tony said. I think being really sort of honest with the board, the hardest thing in this whole agenda is to prioritise. And we've got really good data, we've got really good analysis and information. It's just where you prioritise and around which outcomes. And I think that's the challenge. So we've got lots of, and this might seem quite busy, this diagram, but actually there's so much blood, sweat and tears been behind the negotiation of this in the system with so many different stakeholders that actually it does take us down that road of prioritisation. So it starts that process.
Councillor Child just wants to come back in on that point.
Yeah, just to say on the outcomes would be that the ballooning demand that is coming into the health and care system will not equal a ballooning of financial spend and not equal a worse service and worse health for our public. So we have to do things more efficiently, smarter, but also meet the demand of the extra without having huge costs associated with it, because we've got to stand still basically.
Councillor Galton.
Thanks, Chair. Having been on the Health and Wellbeing Board for a while now, and it is an organisation that invests a lot of time on things like workshops to make sure that people who are from different organisations and used to different ways of working actually can coalesce around ideas and hopefully commit to them. And I appreciate the comment earlier about it's quite quick, this getting 3 departments of the council to work together over the 7 months. It's even more significant if you can get that done between the NHS and local government and other agencies as well. And I think this is actually quite an effective blueprint for people to understand where we're going with the health agenda. And I think one of the things that we need to challenge ourselves with now that we've got it and we're going out and consulting with people is doing some of that prioritisation in terms of what's the really big, crucial thing for you in your own community, what do you think doesn't work for you in the city, and being able to challenge ourselves and our partners to actually do something about that. And if we can achieve that with 2 or 3 particular themes per year, for instance, I think this is something that you will not reach the total effect of it until it's actually been in operation for a good few years. But it's a good start.
Okay. With that, can we agree the recommendations and move to the last paper of today's agenda, apart from the stuff below the line?
Okay, thank you. So this paper is on the Leeds Academic Health Partnership, and the paper basically asking Exec Board just to continue contributing to the Leeds Academic Health Partnership and recognising the contribution that it makes to the economic innovation of the health sector in the city, which is significant. But also it highlights one of the big areas of work streams that it's developing with ourselves about a joint workforce across health and social care, so partly to do with the previous paper. Provides an opportunity to help the sector sort of weather the storms and the workforce issues coming forward. I'm sure we can all imagine what those might be with Brexit and everything else. And it also provides an opportunity to help embed a recovery approach across all of the different bodies that employ people and work with people. And also looking at nursing workforce and social actions such as apprenticeships and getting into deprived communities and helping people get into nursing to make sure we've got a workforce for the future. It's got real potential to work together with the sector, bringing together the academic institutions, which allows the sort of thinking stuff to get into action in the city quickly. That's the plan and the reason behind that, which of course relates to the inclusive growth agenda that we were talking about earlier. So our papers are before you for comment.
Councillor Galton.
Another quick one. When this Leeds Academic Health Partnership turned up, and it initially looked like it was a platform for academics to try out their technology on the population of Leeds to see if it actually enabled people to keep well better. And the challenge went back to them to say, well, actually, can you give us something a little bit more inclusive? And the One Leeds Workforce aspect of this on page 916 is a really good example of an institution in the city listening to a city priority, and I hope to see that included in Council's best plan in their inclusive growth section.
Okay, with that, can we agree the recommendations? And can I ask anyone who isn't entitled to be here to leave the room, please, so we can deal with the items below the line? Thank you.